On the way here, as I was thinking about the whole notion that we need to rethink capitalism, and from my own perspective, because I run a corporate enterprise, the issue is really very close to my heart. I was also reflecting on what I see as changes happening also in the political system that has allowed this so called capitalism 1.0 to thrive. And there are many characteristics of the democratic political system, but I'm going to pull out two of them that have, I think, particular bearing on this topic. Firstly, the notion of a sovereign territorial state that guarantees physical security to its citizens. And secondly, a homogeneous social infrastructure, a sense of national identity that binds us together with common language, common customs, and common traditions. I think a few decades ago, there were relevant arguments for this kind of democracy. Yet these very notions of our political system, or as I say, the indigenization of democracy, need to change because the fundamental reasons for them seem to be, in some sense, null and void. For example, there are really no physical boundaries today. We live in some kind of a borderless world. Rajita mentioned that in this room itself there are people from 30 nations. And I think the point about a blurred sense of identity stems in some sense also from the rise of the multinational corporation. I think when Mr. Ocampo was speaking about the Siemens example, he really brought that point home when he said that the whole sense of who am I and who do I belong to is itself very blurred. So people were thinking, I actually belong to Siemens than belonging to a sense of national identity and so on. So in the sense where today all groups are cross-border, we today subscribe to multiple identities, our company, the Facebook group that we are on, the sense of the social organizations or the spiritual organizations that we belong to, this is actually making the whole notion of capitalism, who we are, democracy, a little blurred and also a little bit confused. Layer on this fact that local governments across the world today are run by a few and economic power is controlled by a few. Clearly, that has not induced any spirit of free markets, and that has led to an inevitable breakdown of the markets. This has resulted in total failure to fulfill local needs at the bottom of the pyramid, and therefore a breakdown in public value. I think the rise of poverty across the world, the rise of impoverishment in some sense is the defining outcome of capitalism 1.0, whereas the whole notion of capitalism was really to have the benefits of economic wealth creation filter down to the bottom of the pyramid. I don't think democracies can really function with economies failing. And that therein is actually a larger danger in the failure of the first version of capitalism. Democracies thrive when economies thrive. And therefore, democracy, the rule of law, human right, and capitalism is highly interlinked. The new capitalism, if we have to rethink and reimagine it, cannot be controlled by the government. Lack of trust in local government has led to violence and a deep sense of fright amongst people living on the fringes of the economy. And this cry is not just limited to emerging economies. This is a cry that can be actually heard worldwide. In this context, what I am proposing is that it is the emergence of the private sector that has to take the responsibility not just to be the new voice of democracy, but also the new face of capitalism 2.0. And this is a bit of a contrarian view because we actually blame the private sector for the failure of the established market economy. But I think there's a change that's going on here. Having gone through the pain of a failed financial system, I think all companies across the world today are doing a lot of introspection and a lot of rethinking about their own role in society. Look at the debate that's going on. Look at the conference out here. we're talking about CSR, we're talking about co-creation of value, we're talking about stewardship, we're talking about trusteeship, and all over the space of the past few years, the entire sense of debate with regard to private sector, community, and society has changed very fast in a really short period of time. It's also a fact that we have to live with that the role of the private sector today far overshadows the role of government, just in terms of numbers, just in terms of sheer impact. I run an education company in India, and if I just pull out a few statistics, almost 80% of seats in engineering colleges in India are controlled by the private sector. Almost 100% of middle class India go to private schools. But look across the world, whether it's telecom, it's healthcare, it's aviation, this is a world that is run and controlled by the private sector, whether we like it or we don't like it. So therefore, capitalism 2.0, as I define it, is probably going to be something where the private sector has to take the lead. And if we are to see the world progressing, we have to see a breakdown of many existing frameworks of democracy as well as capitalism. So some of the seemingly radical ideas are, one, the private sector should bring about these radical changes such as cross-border democracy rather than indigenous democracies. The notion of boundaries is overruled by the notion of a global community. So we should not simply worry about who we are voting for. We should worry about what we are voting for, because issues are becoming less regional and simultaneously much more global. The new capitalism should be more in the sense of trusteeship, in the sense of stewardship, and a sense of shared sovereignty, managed by multilateral institutions, and that would help produce a more viable and a more sustainable world. I think it is also time to think beyond the notion of democracy and also beyond the notion of capitalism. I think in some sense, we are heading towards a notion of a one world family. The path is rough, and what we have been seeing in the breakdown of these institutions is really a fundamental change that is happening. When change happens, there is turmoil and there is turbulence. But I think the direction that we are heading towards is actually a direction of one world family. And as Sri Sri Ravi Shankar says, talks about the notion of Vasudev Kutumbakam, we are all united in one shared spirit. And I think as we go through these changes today, what is finally going to emerge from this is a very different world where the private sector is going to rethink itself. The whole notion that how do we need to balance short-term goals with really long-term sustainable development? I think the future looks bright, even though in the short run, there is a lot of pain within the system.